So next step with the install is we have the engine, the transmission, and now we need to connect the two. And the way we got to go about doing that is installing the clutch. But it's currently on the engine stand, so we're going to start prepping this holy union by getting this engine off the engine stand and start getting the clutch installed, which is currently in this very average looking box. Get that out, start on this clutch install. So we have the hoist attached to the engine. If you haven't watched my uninstall video, basically it's just in reverse, but we have the little Pittsburgh leveler here attached to the ears, the leaves, these small connections on the intake and attached to one of the other portions of the block. We're going to get this balanced out so when I start lifting, it's going to take it up roughly level. I wanted to show you guys the setup though, because I did have to get some extensions in order to make this engine as it was delivered with the flywheel already on, and I didn't want to unbolt any of the flywheel bolts. This is what I had to do, was get a really thick wall aluminum spacer and then snagged some 8/8 bolts in order to get everything attached to the engine with what I thought was a reasonable amount of strength. Also used those spacers to make sure that the block surface wasn't getting scuffed up, that the mating surface wasn't going to be ruined at our attachments. It looks like these are just some type of like cast iron or steel, the base plate there. I had my thick wall aluminum spacers with the washers on there to help protect the block. So we have the engine off the stand, and this is another one of those awesome products by Top End Performance. This is their lightened flywheel. I'll be able to get up some specs for you guys so you know how much weight is actually taken out. But just off the cuff, I do believe they take out over 7 pounds from the stock flywheel. Now in this case, I mean, that could be as much as 30+% of the original weight taken off the flywheel. So this should help make the engine feel more alive, rev happier, and take advantage of a much more sporty rev range. So what I'm going to do next is just clean up the surface that the clutch and the flywheel are going to be contacted on. I'm just using a light amount of brake cleaner on a rag in order to just clean that surface, so you can see beautiful finish, but just get some oil and grime on there as it was packaged and been sitting in the garage, so we want to make sure that's nice and clean and ready to be mated up. Here's the friction disc of the clutch. This is what is actually getting sandwiched in between the pressure plate and the flywheel that transfers the torque from the flywheel, builds the friction onto this plate, and then that pressure is applied by the pressure plate. And so this little guy rides on the splines of the transmission shaft, of the main input shaft, and then what I'm going to be doing is following these instructions to the T, which were included in the kit, and be checking the fitment, cleaning up those splines, making sure they are all nice and greased with a high melting point grease. Make sure that the input shaft of the transmission is nice and cleaned and looking pretty. So we'll get some test fitting done, show you guys the process according to this installation guide, as well as another piece to make sure that you install is this like bell housing template. I'm totally brain farting on the name of this thing, but as you can see, it just is like a template that fits in between the block and the flywheel. It doesn't look like it can actually go on from this point of view, but there's actually two little bolts. There are two little bolts that hold it into place, and then it just gets sandwiched right in between the bell housing and the transmission and the block. But this is going to help us align everything, make sure our bolts are going into the bell housing correctly, as well as making it easier to install the starter, which actually bolts up to the transmission in this case, and there is no outline. It's not actually a portion of the block that the starter bolts up to. So this is a really helpful piece of hardware. And then we also have the clutch. We also have the transmission / clutch inspection cover, and you can take this guy on and off the vehicle to inspect to make sure that the clutch and the transmission is engaging correctly. Here is the flywheel clutch assembly all together. So what you're seeing currently is the pressure plate. Sandwiched in between them is the friction disc, and then we have the flywheel. Some good things to know whenever you're installing a clutch is a lot of times these styles of pressure plates are a little bit bowed or flexed, so they don't come mounting flat to the flywheel. So you need to go in some type of star pattern or equal pattern of bolting it slowly down. You're going to want to use some type of spline tool to align everything, and it should come in and out really easily. I showed the pilot bearing earlier, but that is also something to notice in here is there shouldn't be too much like play or tolerance, and it should slide in concentrically and easy. Something to note as you're bolting this down the pressure plate equally, see where the friction disc is located. Try to get as concentric on the flywheel as possible, especially the pad where it's going to ultimately be rubbing up against and building the friction to transmit the torque to the transmission. So once you have all that aligned, you then want to make sure that the fingers or the actual little lever arms are parallel and flat. They shouldn't be bowed out or in. That would be an indicator that you have installed the pressure plate wrong. So moving over to the transmission, your engine is running well, making some controlled explosions and making some level of torque. The friction disc is being pressed in and held by the pressure plate. That then connects up to your transmission via the bell housing and your main input shaft. This is what the friction disc is actually riding on and spinning as the engine is rotating, and then that is allowed to either be free rotation or actually applying torque using the clutch release bearing, which as you can see is just this little fork, moves back and forth. So this would be the pressure plate engaged, and so if you're in gear you're going to be moving, and then when you want to shift back into neutral or just pushing the clutch to throw the transmission into essentially neutral, you press it in, pressing on the fingers of the pressure plate, which would then free up the connection between the transmission and the engine. Okay, I think that's enough talking. Now we have to bolt the transmission to the rear of the engine block, and there are 4 main bolts in order to do so. And we need to jump the starter on, and we're just about there to drop in the motor into the Conquest. So as you can see, we have the motor in line, prepped and ready for the install. Something I've been really enjoying about the quick jack system is I can essentially drop the entire car almost onto its frame. It's just being lifted by the stock rubber blocks that came with the kit. So that is awesome, really lowers the car. It's going to make it easier to do the install, where then I'll just need to get the car in, over, angled into the engine bay, and then I can start lifting the chassis up to the up to the engine to make it easier for the install, allow me to get in there, get the transmission angled and the engine set onto the crossmember and the mounts. So if you didn't see, this is what I was previously installed when we got the transmission mated. We have that template. Here is the starter motor. Starter motor is held in by 2 17mm bolts there, and all these bolts were torqued down to 40 pounds to mount the transmission to the engine block. And then these guys are actually less, they're around 29 foot-pounds according to the manual. So we're excited to get this thing installed. Let's get to it. Some cool things is I wrote my name right on the back of the cylinder head. One, so you don't have to see it, so it makes it still nice and clean in the engine bay. But I included Isaiah 40:31. This is important to me as when I was 20, I lost one of my best friends in a car crash. And so to me, this is just a verse and a prayer for protection, for especially for our family, but any customer car that I work on. I don't necessarily write this on everything, but it's just one of those remembrances to me and for my customers of, hey, I care about them and desire for their vehicle to be protected. Okay, so I was a little too optimistic. It does not look like I'm going to be able to install the transmission with the shifter attached. There's just not enough clearance from what I'm seeing. I think we'll be okay. We'll probably just take off the rear or the transmission mount as well while I do that. Not the biggest deal, pretty easy to access even from right here, but we're gonna get some serious angle on this install. So update on the engine install. As you guys can see, the engine is in. How I ultimately had to go about doing this is take the mounts, instead of doing my original idea where I was going to have the transmission mounted and the engine mounts half mounted, ended up having to split up the engine and the transmission and come back in with the transmission later. We installed the mounts completely and fully, dropped the motor in, and then aligned the two bolt holes to the cross member is how that ultimately worked out for us. Now, reinstalling the transmission was not easy. As you guys can see in my current setup, I have the quick jacks. This is about half height. Went up to full height, used a little 2x4 on the frame of the jack, and then used that to hold the tail end piece of the transmission into place, and then just aligned it, and having help from a neighbor who helped push the engine slightly back as most of the weight's probably on the nose and it was having a hard time aligning. Moved that into place, slid the transmission in, and so far it aligned perfectly, mounted within like 2 millimeters of the face of the block in that little template I showed you guys earlier. So ended up working out really well. Just took a long time to figure that one out. As you guys can see, currently we have the CX Racing 3-core aluminum radiator installed. I do have an aftermarket shroud and some aftermarket fans, but the stock fans I think will actually work really well, and they come with their own internal sensors that the CX Racing has accommodated in their build of this radiator. So in this case, I think it's going to work out really well. I just installed the stock fans. That should tie in well with the OEM electrical system, and so far has worked fairly seamlessly. We'll see if I end up having any cooling issues, but you get an idea of how the fans mount right there in the stock locations. So the cooling system is darn near finished. Now I am just looking at getting everything buttoned up. The fueling is set up. We have the input there that you can see on the top of the throttle body. Everything is routed to the return line. Currently working on some electrical, making sure everything is back into its original spot, as well as, if you guys can see there, we have the injector wires where I'm going to be installing the new injector clips, which are right here. This is by MKS. I actually have two sets of these, one from Top End Performance and MKS, so we will have spares. So we'll be replacing both sets of injector wires for the new injector clips that will mount up to the new injectors. Almost everything in here is newer refurbished. We have the new coil. I will be using the stock plugs to start the engine, but I do have new spark plug wires, new spark plug, obviously some new spark plugs, and I'm going to be starting it naturally aspirated, so we'll just route. I have a little flexible intake routing that I'll move over here to where the MAF and the air intake is located. Here is the current MAF and intake track. Now we're not going to be routing it directly to the turbo. Like I said, we're going to start it naturally aspirated for the break-in. What I have on order is actually a new complete housing. So if you look here, I used some Permatex to seal the MAF to the original housing, but the new air filter we have accommodates the MAF within it and has a massive air filter on it. So that should be a good upgrade. We won't need to have the stock box anymore, and that will get rid of this eyesore and open up a lot of space. Next up, we have the driveline. So I have replaced the U-joints in here, as well as cleaned up the splines and this little snout that connects to the manual transmission. You get an idea of the U-joints. Just use some universal grease on the outside to help guide and pound these guys back in. You can see the clips that hold those end caps in place. Basically, for the uninstall, you just have to take out the OEM clips on all four sides, work with the U-joints, and I use just a ton of PB Blaster to help break up any rust and the stuff that just seals these things in place. Your new universal joints should feel smooth, but not necessarily wiggly or loose. It should feel nice, tight. So now getting to some of the fun stuff. Here is the 3-inch Mookeh exhaust. Mookehe's a pretty common name in the Conquest Mitsubishi Steryon world. Here you can see we have their downpipe. I am going to have to make some cuts to this, as you can see along those dotted lines, because that flange is not necessary. On ours, it was replaced by Top End Performance, and so that existing flange is already on the turbine housing. So we're going to cut this up as neatly as we can, still make it look good. We'll clean it up and install the exhaust as we prepare for startup. So when I take the actual inside diameter, trying to get the widest piece there. A little hard with one hand. We'll just go with that. That's what the inside diameter ultimately comes out to be. So about 2.85 inches. Roughly 73 millimeters there. In this case, close enough. It's one that Mookeh, I believe, outside of just going and making an exhaust yourself or getting a custom exhaust, is maybe one, if not the only, makers of a Mitsubishi or Chrysler Conquest turbo back exhaust system. So happy to have it, saves me some time, and it's looking good. If you want to continue to watch future episodes, make sure to like and subscribe.